The early sunlight filtered through the lush green foliage, creating a stunning picture in Joseph Miller's garden. This was no ordinary garden but a land filled with life, love, and hope. Rows of fresh vegetables, lines of ripe red tomatoes, heavy squash vines, and ancient apple trees offering shade. All were meticulously cared for by Joseph every single day. At 75, Joseph had spent his entire life tending to this garden. With sun-worn hands and slow, steady steps, he walked between the rows of vegetables, humming an old tune. His eyes sparkled whenever he spotted a new sprout emerging or a ripe fruit hanging from a branch. To him, the garden was not just a source of sustenance but also a point of pride. That morning, Joseph prepared a basket of fresh produce to bring to the community center at the end of the street, a place where he regularly donated his harvest to those in need. The neighbors often called him the kind-hearted gardener, because they knew Joseph was always ready to help others. As he placed the basket on his old bicycle, a group of young men passed by, waving, "Good morning, Mr. Joseph, delivering veggies again today?" asked Daniel, a cheerful young man. Joseph smiled warmly in response. "That's right, son. Can't let my garden's produce go to waste. Can I?" Joseph's figure gradually disappeared down the small path. But little did he know, his peaceful days were about to be disrupted. A hidden storm was brewing on the horizon. Across town, in a small cafe, 3 police officers, Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed, sat chatting idly. They were infamous in the area, known for their arrogance and racist tendencies. Kevin, the ringleader, was tall, blonde, and sharp-eyed. He set his coffee cup down on the table and smirked. "I heard that old black man at the end of the street has a whole garden full of vegetables. I bet he doesn't need all of that. I think we should pay him a visit." Patrick burst into loud laughter. "What's there to check? We're the cops. What can an old man like him do anyway?" Marcus remained silent, nodding in agreement, though a hint of hesitation flickered in his mind. He didn't dare go against Kevin and Patrick. The 3 officers discussed Joseph's garden as if it were a prize to be claimed, armed with authority and their disregard for people of color. They gave no thought to the consequences of the actions they were about to take. That afternoon, Joseph was sitting in his garden, pulling weeds. The sound of birds singing and the cool breeze made him feel an unusual sense of peace. But this tranquility was quickly shattered when a police car sped up and screeched to a halt in front of his gate. The 3 officers stepped out, their faces full of challenge. Kevin O'Connor approached, his eyes scanning the garden with greedy interest. "Well, old man, this garden of yours looks pretty nice, doesn't it?" Joseph looked up at them and replied politely, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. How can I help you?" Patrick Hill sneered. "We don't need any help, old man. We just wanted to take a look at all the good stuff you're growing. Shame to waste it on those homeless people." Hearing this, Joseph frowned. "This is my garden. You have no right." Kevin suddenly shoved him to the ground. Joseph cried out in pain, but no one nearby heard him. The officers stormed into the garden and began wreaking havoc. They pulled up plants, trampled vegetables underfoot, and grabbed whatever they fancied. Joseph struggled to his feet, his voice shaking as he said, "You'll pay for this. I won't let this go." Patrick laughed loudly and leaned down to whisper, "Pay? An old man like you? No one cares." The wounds on Joseph's body hurt less than the ache in his heart. The garden he had cherished for so many years was now being destroyed mercilessly. Sarah Matthews, 25 years old, was a young woman who had just graduated from college and returned to live with her parents in the house across from Mr. Joseph's garden. She had long brown hair and gentle yet sharp blue eyes. Since coming back, Sarah had grown accustomed to the sight of Mr. Joseph tending his garden every day. The old man would often smile and wave when he saw her standing by the window, and sometimes he even brought a basket of apples to her family. That afternoon, Sarah was working at the desk near her window. A soft breeze swayed the curtains, and the golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass. She glanced outside absent-mindedly and froze. 3 police officers, their faces hard and hostile, were stepping through the gate into Mr. Joseph's garden. Sarah's heart began to race. She saw Mr. Joseph rise to his feet, his hands covered in dirt, still holding a small trowel. He greeted them with the same smile he gave everyone. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. How can I help you?" But the officers' expressions were anything but friendly. Kevin O'Connor approached with heavy steps and a cold gaze. "This garden's pretty nice. Old man, what are you growing all these vegetables for?" Patrick Hill circled the rows of plants, his dirty boots crushing a few young sprouts. He laughed as Mr. Joseph called out urgently, "Stop! Please don't ruin my plants." From her vantage point, Sarah clutched her phone tightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're police officers. Why are they doing this?" she muttered, then quickly turned on her camera and started recording. She saw Kevin shove Mr. Joseph to the ground, his voice rough and condescending. "Hey, old man, who said you could talk back to us? Is this your land?" Mr. Joseph propped himself up, his voice weak but resolute. "This is my home. You are trespassing and destroying." Patrick Hill snickered, picking up a ripe red tomato from the ground and crushing it in his hand. "Doesn't matter whose land this is. We're just here to take what we want." Marcus Reed lingered in the background, his eyes darting around nervously as if afraid of being caught. He frowned briefly when he saw Mr. Joseph lying still on the ground, but he didn't dare interfere with his colleagues. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The sight of Mr. Joseph being humiliated and his garden destroyed filled her with both anger and fear. Her hands trembled as she held the phone, but she kept recording everything. Then Kevin threw a shovel against the base of a tree and shouted, his voice dripping with contempt, "You're not going to do anything, old man. Remember that." The 3 officers turned and walked away, leaving the garden in ruins and Mr. Joseph lying motionless among the broken plants. Sarah rushed down the stairs, tears welling up as she thought of the kind and gentle old man. She ran across the small road and into the garden. Her heart clenched when she saw Mr. Joseph lying there, his trembling hand gripping the soil as if trying to stand. Blood from a scrape on his forehead trickled down, mixing with the muddy earth under the dim evening light. "Mr. Joseph, are you okay?" Sarah cried, her voice shaking. Mr. Joseph opened his eyes weakly, recognizing his young neighbor. He tried to smile, but his face twisted in pain. "Sarah, they destroyed everything." Sarah took his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm calling an ambulance right now. They won't get away with this. I promise." She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice urgent and choked with emotion. Inside Sarah, a fire of fury had ignited. She knew this truth had to be brought to light. David Miller sat in his office in New York, buried deep in a stack of complex case files. As a talented federal prosecutor, he was no stranger to long, grueling days. The ringing of the phone on his desk pulled him out of his thoughts. Seeing the name of the hospital from his hometown on the screen, his heart tightened. "This is David Miller," he answered, his voice calm and steady. On the other end was the voice of a nurse. "Mr. Miller, your father, Mr. Joseph Miller, has just been brought to the hospital. He was attacked. His condition is quite serious." The brief statement hit David like a bolt of lightning. He shot to his feet, the files scattering to the floor. But he didn't care. His voice was urgent. "Attacked? Who did this? Is my father okay? We don't know the details yet, but he's injured and needs monitoring. You should come right away." David barely heard the rest. He bolted out of his office, dialing to book the earliest flight back to town. During the flight, memories of his father, the strong man who had raised him with sweat and love, flooded his mind. Visions of Joseph's rough hands tending the garden, his gentle smile, and his quiet sacrifices blurred David's vision with tears. When he arrived at the hospital, David sprinted down the long hallway, his heart pounding. He pushed open the door to the room and saw his father lying there, his face marked with bruises and cuts. Joseph's eyes fluttered open, weak but still carrying a calm resolve. "Dad?" David choked out, grasping his father's hand. Joseph spoke softly, his voice trembling. "David, they destroyed my garden. They think I can't do anything." David squeezed his father's hand tighter, his eyes burning with determination. In that moment, he was no longer just a prosecutor but a son carrying a profound responsibility. He leaned down, his voice low but resolute. "Dad, promise, I'll make them pay. Justice will be served." Joseph looked at his son, a single tear sliding down his weathered face. He believed that David, the boy he had raised with all his love and values, would stand up for him and for anyone who had ever faced injustice. In that small hospital room, promise was made, and a storm was about to rise. The evening sky turned a somber shade of gray as David stepped out of the hospital, his heart heavy with a mix of rage and sorrow. He paused on the steps, taking a deep breath to suppress the tightness in his chest. The image of his frail father being attacked, and the garden, his life's pride reduced to ruin, played relentlessly in his mind. When he arrived at the house, David stared at the devastation before him. The once lush green rows of vegetables were now trampled and broken, with muddy soil scattered everywhere. Crushed tomatoes lay in deep red smears, while uprooted plants were strewn carelessly across the ground. Every detail felt like a dagger to his heart. Nearby, Sarah stood, her expression filled with remorse and anger. She approached him cautiously, pulling her phone from her pocket. "David, I have evidence. I recorded everything." David looked up, a spark of hope igniting in his cold, steely gaze. He took the phone and opened the video. On the small screen, the three officers were clearly visible, walking into the garden and attacking his father. Kevin O'Connor's contemptuous voice and Joseph's faint cries echoed through the recording, making David grip the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They will pay for this," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Thank you, Sarah. You're braver than most people." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "David, you know who they are. They're the police. If this video gets out, I'm afraid they'll come after me." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "I will protect you. They may have power, but no one is above the law. Trust me." A glimmer of hope flickered in Sarah's heart as she met David's unwavering gaze. She knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but with David Miller, a federal prosecutor, on the case, there was now a real chance for justice. That night, David sat alone in his father's living room. The family photos on the walls seemed to whisper memories of the past and of everything Joseph had sacrificed to raise him. He looked at the phone once more, playing the video back, then began formulating a plan. They wouldn't get away with this. The next morning, David went straight to the local police station to file a formal complaint. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and black tie, his calm yet commanding presence drew more than a few glances. He pushed open the door to the complaints office, his voice clear and unwavering. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge. I'm here to file a complaint against 3 police officers, Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed, for assaulting my father." Joseph Miller. The officer sitting behind the desk stared at him, wide-eyed, stammering. "Are you sure? There. David cut him off, his gaze sharp as a blade. "They're police officers. I know, but they're also criminals. I have solid evidence. Get the person in charge here immediately." Police Chief Stephen Ray entered the room, a middle-aged man with a mustache and an air of authority. He sized David up with a look of disdain and said, "And who might you be, accusing my men? Are you?" David stepped forward and placed the phone with the video evidence on the desk. "I'm David Miller, a federal prosecutor, and this is proof of your 3 officers trespassing, assaulting, and destroying my father's property. I demand an immediate investigation." Chief Stephen Ray frowned as he watched the video, his expression shifting subtly. But within seconds, he masked it with a cold, dismissive tone. "We'll look into it, but don't get your hopes up, Miller. No one likes someone coming in here and telling us how to do our jobs." David straightened, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I won't stop until justice is served. Remember this, no one is above the law. Not even you." David turned and walked out, leaving behind a heavy silence that lingered in the air. Behind his stoic facade, Chief Stephen Ray felt a storm begin to brew. In the quiet hospital room, the fading afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the white-tiled floor. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoed softly, a constant reminder of Joseph's fragile life. David sat beside his father's bed, his eyes still carrying the weight of worry and anger. To him, his father, the great man who had sacrificed everything to raise him, now looked so small and frail amidst the bandages and bruises. Joseph slowly opened his eyes, his voice soft like a gentle breeze. "David, how long have you been sitting here?" David leaned closer, taking his father's thin but still warm hand in his. "I've been here since morning. Did you sleep well?" Joseph nodded faintly, but the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. He could see it clearly. David was planning something significant. His voice, though weak, was steady and full of resolve. "David, I know you won't let this go, but I don't want you taking risks. I'm fine. As long as the garden can be restored." David looked deeply into his father's eyes, his brow furrowed with determination. "Dad, what they did was unacceptable. Not just for you, but for everyone who has ever suffered injustice at their hands. I won't let them get away with this." Joseph sighed softly, his gaze drifting to the window where the last rays of sunlight were fading. In his heart was fear for his son, but also an overwhelming sense of pride. He squeezed David's hand tighter, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You've always been a warrior, David, but don't let hatred cloud your judgment. Do the right thing. But remember, justice is not revenge." David nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll do what's right, but I won't forgive them for this." The room fell silent for a moment. David looked at his father's face, the wrinkles and silver hair a testament to a life of hardship and sacrifice. In those lines, David found renewed strength. He stood up, pulling the blanket gently over Joseph. "Rest now, Dad. I'll handle everything. Your garden will thrive again, and they won't dare destroy another inch of land." Joseph closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek. He trusted his son. He believed that David would rise and fight for justice, not just for him, but for all who had been wronged. That night, David sat quietly by his father's bedside, his mind ablaze with plans. He knew this fight would not be easy, but he would not stop until those responsible paid the price. In Sarah Matthews' small house, tension filled the air. She sat on an old wooden chair, facing David, who was spreading out documents and evidence across the table. The video Sarah had recorded had become the centerpiece of their case. It was the strongest weapon they had. But David knew they would need more than that to win this fight. Sarah looked at David, her voice filled with worry. "David, I've spoken to some of the neighbors. They all know about those 3 officers. They've bullied, threatened, and hurt a lot of people in this area. But everyone is too scared to testify." David looked up, a determined light flashing in his eyes. "Then we need to show them there's nothing to fear anymore. I'll make sure they're safe. Sarah, can you help me meet with a few of them?" Sarah nodded, though fear still lingered in her heart. She worried that the corrupt officers might return to threaten her and her family. But seeing David's unwavering determination gave her a newfound sense of courage. That evening, David and Sarah began visiting houses throughout the neighborhood. David spoke to each family, one by one. He listened to their stories of pain and injustice, lives that had been oppressed and scarred by the 3 officers' abuse of power. The tears of mothers and the fear in the eyes of children became the fuel driving David to press on. A middle-aged man named Henry Thompson spoke through his tears. I saw them beat my son just because he rode his bike through the neighborhood. They said he looked suspicious. I was too scared to file a complaint. But if you're really going to help us this time, I'll stand up and testify. Henry wasn't the only one. The deeper David dug, the more he uncovered the corruption festering within the local police system. Each story became a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing that the three officers were not just criminals but symbols of a long-standing system of injustice. That night, David returned home with a folder full of evidence. He sat down at the desk, spreading out the collected testimonies and proof before him. As he looked over everything they had gathered, he realized that this fight was no longer just a personal case. This was a battle for justice, for his father and for everyone who had been wronged. In the quiet of the night, David sat in Joseph's study, his hands flipped through pages of documents, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. On the desk lay Sarah's video, witness testimonies, and the compiled evidence against the three officers, Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her voice hurried and anxious. David, there's a strange car lingering outside my house. I'm scared they know about everything. David shot to his feet, his voice firm and steady. Stay inside. I'm coming over right now. Don't open the door for anyone. As David drove to Sarah's house, he caught sight of a black car turning a corner and disappearing into the darkness. Sarah stood at the door waiting for him, her face pale but her eyes still fierce and unwavering. They're trying to intimidate you, Sarah. But don't worry. They won't dare touch you if we don't back down, David said, his voice low and filled with determination. Sarah looked at him, trust shining in her eyes. I'm not giving up, David. We have to see this through to the end. David nodded, his gaze drifting toward the still, silent night. Inside him, a storm was rising. The battle was closing in, and he knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. In that darkness, the light of justice continued to burn, brighter and stronger than ever before. That night, an unusual stillness hung over the small town. The wind whispered through the trees lining the streets, creating a soft rustling sound, like murmurs in the darkness. After reassuring Sarah, David returned to Joseph's house, feeling an invisible tension thickening the air. As though something was waiting to erupt, David sat at his father's desk, methodically organizing the collected evidence. His mind was clear, his plan precise. By morning, he would send all the evidence to the federal court and formally file charges against the three officers. There would be no escape for them. Suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence outside. It was faint, but in the stillness of the night, it rang out like an alarm bell. David stood up, moved to the window, and peered out. In the dim darkness, he spotted a black car parked nearby. His headlights were off, but he could make out the vague silhouettes of people sitting inside. David clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Pulling out his phone, he dialed Police Chief Stephen Ray. The call connected, and Stephen's voice came through, slow and laced with mockery. Well, Mr. Miller, still awake at this hour? Are we? David exhaled sharply, his voice tight with anger. I want to report a suspicious car watching my house. You know, I have a feeling they're your people. On the other end, Stephen let out a cold laugh. You think I don't know what you're up to, Miller? You'd better watch yourself. Accidents happen all the time around here. You wouldn't want to get hit by a car in the middle of the night, would you? David gripped the phone tighter, his voice cutting like a blade. You think threats will make me back down? You're wrong. I won't stop until I drag you all into the light. Stephen didn't respond. The line went dead abruptly. In the darkness outside, David saw the black car's engine roar to life before it sped off and disappeared into the night. A chilling stillness returned to the room, but a cold resolve settled over David. He knew now that he had entered a battle far more dangerous than he had imagined. The next morning, David met with the witnesses who had agreed to testify in the case. Sarah accompanied him, clutching a small voice recorder, ready to document every word. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her eyes reflected unwavering determination. Their first stop was Henry Thompson, the middle-aged man who had witnessed firsthand the injustices committed by the three officers. Henry sat in his small living room, his calloused hands clasped tightly together. There was a flicker of fear in his eyes, but when he saw David, trust replaced it. "Mr. Thompson, are you ready?" David asked, his voice calm and encouraging. Henry took a deep breath before he began to speak. "I remember it like it was yesterday. 2 years ago. My son was just 16. He was riding his bike to buy some bread when Patrick Hill stopped him. He said my boy looked suspicious. Then he shoved him off his bike, claiming he needed to inspect it, but it was just an excuse to intimidate him. When I ran over to intervene, Kevin and Marcus showed up too. They told me to shut my mouth if I didn't want to end up in jail." Henry's voice broke, his eyes welling up with tears as he relived that painful day. He turned to David, his gaze resolute. "I've been silent for too long, but now, I won't be afraid anymore. I want to tell the truth, not just for my son, but for Mr. Joseph and everyone else they've oppressed." David nodded, gripping Henry's hand firmly in a silent gesture of gratitude. Sarah recorded every word, her face full of quiet emotion. One by one, the other witnesses came forward. A young woman recounted how Kevin O'Connor had threatened her when she tried to report him for harassing her younger brother. An elderly man, his voice trembling with emotion, shared how he had been intimidated when he protested an unlawful search of his home. Each testimony was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Every story, every voice, strengthened the case against the corrupt officers. David knew now that he had gathered enough power to stand against the men who had terrorized this community for far too long. At the end of the day, David sat alone in a local attorney's office, surrounded by thick stacks of case files. He stared at the laptop in front of him, the screen displaying the finalized lawsuit. In it, Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed were listed as defendants in a case involving assault, abuse of power, and property destruction. David picked up his phone and called a trusted contact at the federal office, Linda Cooper, a federal attorney and one of his close colleagues. "Linda, I need your help to fast-track this case. We can't let them get away with this any longer." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Linda responded. "David, I know how important this is, but you need to be careful. This is going to be a tough fight, and they won't go down quietly." David gave a faint, determined smile. "I don't care. What they did to my father is unforgivable. I'll do whatever it takes to expose them." Linda sighed but agreed. "All right, send me the lawsuit. I'll personally review it and push it through to federal court." After emailing the document, David sat still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the computer screen. He knew this was only the beginning. A long and grueling battle awaited him, one against men with power, and one that carried risks for him, Sarah, and the brave witnesses who had chosen to speak up. That night, as David stepped out of the office, the cold wind hit his face, but it couldn't extinguish the fire burning within him. He looked up at the night sky and whispered, as though making a promise to his father, "Justice will be served. You'll see it soon." David's figure disappeared into the darkness, but on his shoulders rested a weight of trust and great responsibility. The lawsuit had been filed, and the storm of justice was drawing near. The next morning, the normally peaceful town seemed to be experiencing an earthquake. News of David Miller's lawsuit against Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed had spread everywhere. Local newspapers quickly ran headlines in bold print. "Federal prosecutor's son sues 3 police officers for violence and abuse of power." At the town's central cafe, residents gathered to talk. Some supported David, saying it was time to face the truth. Others hesitated, afraid that taking on the police would only make matters worse. At the police station, Chief Stephen Ray slammed the newspaper onto his desk, his face red with anger. Sitting in front of him were the three accused officers. Kevin O'Connor, his teeth clenched, slammed his fist on the table. That old man and his bastard son are trying to take us down. I won't let this slide. Stephen looked at his subordinates, his voice calculated and cold. Calm down. This is still under control. I'll speak with the judge. But we need to be careful. That video is a big problem. Patrick Hill, visibly impatient, interjected. If we have to, we'll make that old man drop the case. A little intimidation. Stephen raised a sharp eyebrow, cutting him off with a frosty tone. Stop it. Things are already too exposed. Now is the time to bend the truth, not to resort to violence. Marcus Reed remained silent, his face etched with worry. Unlike Kevin and Patrick, a small piece of his conscience still lingered, but he didn't dare voice any objections. Meanwhile, at Joseph's house, David sat at the old dining table, surrounded by stacks of documents. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from colleagues, lawyers, and reporters. Across from him, Sarah sat pale and tense, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. David, what do you think they'll do next? Sarah asked quietly. David looked at her, his sharp gaze softening slightly to reassure her. They'll try to intimidate us, twist the story, or turn the situation around. But we can't let them win. Justice always belongs to the truth. Suddenly, a knock on the door echoed through the house. Both David and Sarah flinched. Startled, David stood and moved cautiously toward the window to check. Outside stood a middle-aged woman, her face filled with worry. David opened the door, and she spoke immediately, her voice trembling. Mr. Miller, I'm Margaret Cole. I need to talk to you. Margaret stepped inside, nervously glancing around as though afraid of being watched. David nodded encouragingly. Take your time. What is it? Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. I used to work as an administrative assistant at the police station. I know about a lot of things Kevin, Patrick, and even Stephen Ray have done. They've been covering for each other for years. I have documents that might help you. David sat up straight, his eyes sharp with focus. Are you serious? Where are these documents? Margaret pulled a large envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. David opened it, his eyes widening in shock. Inside were internal reports, notes, and edited records that had been manipulated to cover up multiple past incidents, all of which led back to Stephen Ray and the three officers. Sarah whispered, "We have more evidence now." David looked at Margaret, his voice firm and resolute. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Cole. I'll protect you and make sure those responsible face justice." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't stay silent any longer." 2 days later, the first court hearing was held. The federal courthouse, located in the heart of the city, was surrounded by a crowd of townspeople. Signs reading "Justice for Joseph Miller" were held high. Reporters from major news outlets had gathered to cover the case that was causing a public uproar. David walked into the courtroom in a sharp suit, his face filled with determination. Beside him, Sarah clutched her notebook tightly. Across the room, they saw the three officers, Kevin, Patrick, and Marcus. Kevin still wore his arrogant smirk, while Patrick glanced around the room as if it were all a joke. Marcus, however, kept his head lowered, a flicker of tension evident in his eyes. Judge Eleanor Brooks, a woman known for her stern yet fair demeanor, entered the room. The sound of her gavel echoed. This court is now in session for the case involving the assault of Joseph Miller and allegations of abuse of power. David stood, stepping into the center of the room, his voice strong and unwavering. "Your Honor, today I stand before you to seek justice for my father, Joseph Miller, a kind, hard-working man who was attacked and humiliated by 3 police officers in his own garden. But this case goes beyond a single incident. It is a symbol of a system plagued by abuse of power, cover-ups, and a lack of accountability. Today, the truth will come to light. David presented the video Sarah had recorded. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with tension. Kevin's mocking laughter, Patrick's insults, and the footage of Joseph being shoved to the ground brought tears to the eyes of many spectators. Kevin's attorney quickly countered, arguing that the video might have been tampered with. But David was ready, responding firmly, "This evidence is not isolated. We have witness testimonies and internal documents that reveal a systemic pattern of cover-ups." David placed the files provided by Margaret Cole onto the table. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the weight of the evidence began to sink in. Kevin's confident facade began to crack, and Patrick whispered anxiously to his attorney. Judge Brooks banged her gavel, restoring order. "The court will reconvene tomorrow. I expect all parties to be fully prepared." David turned to Sarah, his eyes blazing with determination. The real battle had begun, and he had no intention of backing down. The perpetrators would face justice. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as David exited the courthouse. An elderly woman approached him, her wrinkled hands reaching for his. "You're our hope, David. You must win." David smiled warmly, clasping her hand firmly. "I promise. I won't let you down." That afternoon, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, as if signaling that a ray of justice was about to shine down on this small town. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. It seemed as though the entire town had turned its attention to this trial. Major news networks continued to report on the case, and the atmosphere outside was electric with tension. Supporters of Mr. Joseph held banners high, reading, "No one is above justice," and "Fairness for Mr. Miller." David sat at the plaintiff's table, his sharp gaze fixed on the defendants. Kevin O'Connor still wore his trademark arrogance, but Patrick Hill was beginning to fidget nervously. Marcus Reed, the quietest of the three, sat with his head lowered, his hands clenched tightly as though he were hiding something. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered the room, her commanding and icy stare silencing the room instantly. She struck her gavel against the bench, her voice ringing out, "This court will now resume. Plaintiff's counsel, please call your first witness." David rose, straightening his tie, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, I call Henry Thompson to the stand." Henry Thompson walked into the courtroom, a middle-aged man with graying hair and resolute eyes. He had steeled himself for this moment. Standing at the witness stand, Henry stared directly at the three officers, as if to remind them that he was no longer afraid. David approached, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Thompson, can you recount the events involving your son and what you witnessed that day?" Henry nodded, his eyes filled with pain but unwavering. 2 years ago, my son, he was just 16 at the time, was riding his bike through a neighborhood when Patrick Hill stopped him. Patrick claimed my boy looked suspicious. When my son asked why, Patrick shoved him to the ground, saying it was to inspect the bike. I ran over to intervene, but then Kevin and Marcus showed up. Kevin threatened me, saying if I didn't shut my mouth, I'd be arrested for obstructing a police officer. The defense table stirred uneasily. Kevin's lawyer shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection. This testimony is not directly relevant to the current case." David turned to the judge, his tone measured but razor-sharp. "Your Honor, this testimony demonstrates a clear pattern of systemic abuse of power and recurring behavior by the defendants. It sheds light on their character." Judge Brooks considered for a moment before nodding. "Objection overruled. The witness may continue." Henry turned back toward Kevin, Patrick, and Marcus. His voice trembled, but his words carried unmistakable conviction. "That day, I stayed silent out of fear, but now, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm here to tell the truth." David nodded, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. No further questions." As Henry stepped down from the witness stand, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, Someone in town had publicly dared to stand against those in power. Kevin glanced nervously at Patrick, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. Patrick's face twitched with tension, while Marcus sat frozen, his knuckles white against the table. David exchanged a brief look with Sarah, his eyes reflecting both determination and hope. The battle for justice had begun in earnest, and the walls were starting to close in on the corrupt officers. The trial continued, with the tension in the room steadily rising. David called more witnesses to the stand, from Margaret Cole, who provided the internal documents, to townspeople who had suffered under the abuse of power by the three officers. Each testimony struck like a sharp blade, cutting deeper into the already crumbling image of Kevin, Patrick, and Marcus. The defense attorneys began to fight back, accusing the video of being doctored and blaming Mr. Joseph for provoking the situation. Their arguments stirred anger among many in the courtroom. Then it was Marcus Reed's turn to testify. As Marcus walked to the stand, his face was pale. David approached him, his voice calm but heavy with pressure. "Mr. Reed, can you recount what happened on that day?" Marcus glanced toward Kevin and Patrick. Kevin sat stiffly, his brow furrowed, his glare a clear warning. Patrick shifted uneasily beside him. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I don't remember clearly," he muttered, his voice faltering. David raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze piercing through Marcus, as though seeing straight into his soul. "Mr. Reed, I remind you that you are under oath to tell the truth. If you lie, you will face charges of perjury." Marcus exhaled shakily, his eyes heavy with guilt. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited, holding their breath. Finally, he broke. They planned it beforehand. Kevin and Patrick said they wanted to teach the old black man a lesson. I didn't want to go along with it, but I was afraid to go against them. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Kevin shot to his feet, shouting in fury, "Marcus, what the hell are you saying?" Judge Brooks slammed her gavel forcefully, her voice cutting through the noise. "Order! Sit down immediately, Mr. Reed. Continue." Marcus dropped his head, his voice trembling with regret. They deliberately looked for an excuse to destroy Mr. Joseph's garden. They thought no one would do anything about it. I was wrong. I shouldn't have stayed silent." David straightened, his voice ringing out like a bell of justice. "Thank you, Marcus. No further questions." Kevin's face turned crimson, and he slammed his fist on the table in frustration. Patrick, meanwhile, looked ashen, his confidence shattered. The courtroom's energy shifted completely. Marcus's confession was like a fatal blow, slicing through the web of lies and cover-ups orchestrated by the three officers. The tide had turned, and for the first time, the truth shone brightly in the room. The court adjourned for the afternoon. In the waiting room, David sat with Sarah, his eyes fixed on the stacks of documents before him. Sarah watched him, her voice soft and careful. Marcus Reed confessed, "Do you think we have enough to win?" David closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and nodded. "We've come further than I expected, but there's still one final battle. They'll fight back with everything they have." Outside the waiting room, Kevin and Patrick stood with their lawyers, their expressions dark and tense. Kevin, seething with anger, muttered, "That bastard Marcus. I'll deal with him later, but right now, we need to tear down every piece of testimony." That afternoon, during the court session, Kevin and Patrick's attorneys launched an aggressive attack on the witnesses, trying to sow doubt and undermine their credibility. They argued that Marcus Reed's confession was nothing but an attempt to reduce his own guilt, and claimed that Mr. Joseph had provoked the officers. David stepped forward to respond, his voice steady, clear, and filled with conviction. "Your Honor, what we have here is undeniable evidence of systemic abuse of power and deliberate acts of violence by the defendants. The video, the witnesses' testimonies, and Marcus Reed's own confession have laid bare the truth. This is no longer just about Mr. Joseph, it's about fairness. accountability, and ethics in our society. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. David's words ignited a spark, a fire of belief in justice, in the hearts of those present. Judge Brooks looked at both sides, her voice steady and authoritative. The court will take time to review all the evidence and deliver a verdict tomorrow. David turned, his gaze locking onto Kevin and Patrick. They still tried to maintain their composure, but deep in their eyes, fear had taken root. Tomorrow, justice would finally come to light. On the morning of the sentencing, the atmosphere in the town was more tense than ever. Crowds flooded the courthouse, so much so that part of the main street had to be closed off. Banners reading "Justice for Joseph Miller" and "No one is above the law" were everywhere. People held hands tightly, their hearts full of hope. David stood before the mirror in a small room near the courthouse. His deep blue suit and neatly knotted tie made him look calm and composed. But inside, his heart was pounding. He thought of his father, a man who had spent his life quietly doing what was right, only to become a victim of injustice. Today would be the day David restored justice for him. When he stepped outside, Sarah was waiting, a file of documents clutched tightly in her hands. Her face showed traces of tension, but her eyes shone with trust and determination. "David, we've come so far. Today is for Mr. Joseph. We can't lose." David smiled and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Sarah. We'll finish this. They will pay for what they've done." In the courtroom was packed. There wasn't a single empty seat. From journalists and townspeople to supporters of David and Mr. Joseph, everyone was watching intently. The tension was so thick that even the sound of a deep breath seemed loud. Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed sat at the defendant's table. Kevin tried to appear calm, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed his nerves. Patrick fidgeted restlessly, his eyes darting around the room. Marcus Reed sat motionless, his face heavy with resignation, as though he had accepted his fate. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered, and the entire room rose to their feet. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply as she declared, "This court is now in session. Having reviewed all evidence, witness testimonies, and arguments from both sides, I will now allow closing statements." David stood, walking to the center of the courtroom. He looked around the room before fixing his gaze on the defendants. His voice rang out clearly, each word striking with precision. "Your Honor, we have seen the truth laid bare. Sarah Matthews' video clearly shows the three defendants assaulting Mr. Joseph Miller, an elderly, kind-hearted man. But this incident is not isolated. Testimonies from witnesses prove a pattern of systemic abuse, a culture of cover-ups, and organized misconduct. For far too long, men like Kevin O'Connor and Patrick Hill have believed they could stand above the law. But today, we have a chance to show that justice still exists. Turning to Judge Brooks, David held up the documents provided by Margaret Cole. "These records reveal the hidden truth. This is not just a single act of violence, but a symptom of a system riddled with injustice and corruption. Today, we must say no to this." The courtroom was silent, David's words igniting a flame of hope in everyone present. He returned to his seat, his expression confident and resolute. Kevin's lawyer stood, attempting one final defense, though his voice trembled. "Your Honor, what happened that day was not as it appears. The video does not show the whole truth. My clients were simply doing their jobs. This case has been blown out of proportion." But no one in the room believed the weak justification. The moment of judgment, Judge Brooks scanned the room, her gaze sharp and commanding. Her voice rang out, firm and final. "After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, this court finds the defendants Kevin O'Connor, Patrick Hill, and Marcus Reed guilty of aggravated assault, abuse of power, and property destruction. Kevin O'Connor and Patrick Hill are sentenced to 15 years in prison without parole. Marcus Reed, due to his cooperation and confession, is sentenced to 5 years in prison." The gavel struck, The courtroom erupted. People cried, hugged, and celebrated. Sarah grasped David's hand, tears streaming down her face, but a smile of victory spread across her lips. "We did it." David turned to look at his father, Joseph Miller, sitting in his wheelchair in the front row. Tears glistened in Joseph's eyes, but they were tears of pride and happiness. He nodded gently at his son, as if to say, "You did it, David. You brought justice." Outside, the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, as though it, too, was celebrating the triumph of truth and justice. 2 weeks after the trial, the atmosphere in the town had completely changed. The storm had passed, giving way to peace and hope. News of the case had spread across the country, and Joseph Miller's story had become a symbol of the fight against injustice and abuse of power. Joseph's garden was coming back to life. New rows of tomatoes had been planted, and vibrant green shoots began to sprout in the fresh soil. In the middle of the garden, Joseph sat on his old wooden chair, smiling as he watched the young plants reaching up to embrace the sunlight. David stood beside him, holding a basket of fresh seeds. He crouched down, carefully scooping the soil and planting each seed with precision. Joseph looked at his son, his voice gentle and filled with pride. "You've done what I always believed in. You stood up and brought justice back." David looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face. "You taught me that sometimes standing up against what's wrong is the hardest thing to do, but it's always worth it." Sarah entered the garden, a camera in her hands. She crouched down and captured the moment of father and son tending the garden, an image of peace and profound meaning. She grinned brightly. "Mr. Joseph, your garden is almost back to what it once was." Joseph nodded, his eyes shining with joy. "This garden isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes in goodness, who believes in justice." David stood up, looking at the clear blue sky. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and new growth. His heart swelled with a renewed sense of hope. He knew that no matter how difficult the fight, justice would always prevail, like these seeds, buried deep in the dark soil, yet still pushing through to grow strong and tall. A new dawn had come to the town, bringing with it the light of truth, hope, and courage. 3 days after the trial, the town still reverberated with the echoes of the fight for justice. Local newspapers ran bold headlines: "Justice triumphs," "A historic lawsuit in a small town," and "Joseph Miller a symbol of resistance against injustice." Everywhere, people talked about the case, about Joseph's courage, and the determination of his son, David. Joseph's garden had become a new symbol. Townspeople visited more often, bringing seeds, saplings, and heartfelt wishes. They stood beside Joseph, offering apologies for having stayed silent for so long. An elderly woman named Mary Williams approached, holding a bouquet of flowers, bowing her head. She spoke softly to Joseph. "Mr. Joseph, I've witnessed too many injustices but never had the courage to speak out. You and your son have given me the strength to believe in what's right. Please accept this small gift." Joseph smiled, his frail hand gently taking hers. "We always have the chance to do what's right. It's never too late." Meanwhile, David and Sarah were holding a small meeting with the townspeople at the community center. Standing before the crowd, David's eyes reflected both seriousness and warmth. "My father's case was never just a personal story. It's a wake-up call that we cannot stay silent in the face of injustice. If each of us dares to speak up and take action, no one will be able to abuse their power to trample on others." Applause erupted, echoing like a bell of awakening. The townspeople began discussing ideas, suggesting the creation of a community oversight council to ensure accountability from both the authorities and the police. From across the room, Sarah watched David with a proud smile. "You've changed this town, David. You and Mr. Joseph." David turned to her, his gaze gentle. "We've changed it, Sarah. No one does this alone." Outside, the golden light of the late afternoon sun bathed the small town, illuminating its quiet streets. The town had weathered a storm, and now it was beginning to heal and thrive again. On a softly rainy afternoon, Marcus Reed stood at the gate of Joseph's house. His police uniform had been replaced by a simple shirt and faded jeans. In his hands, he held a small bag, his eyes filled with regret. Joseph sat on his wooden chair on the porch, an old book in his hands. When he saw Marcus approaching, he looked up, his gaze calm but not unkind. "What brings you here, Marcus?" Joseph's voice was deep and warm, carrying no trace of bitterness. Marcus hesitated, his hands gripping the small bag tightly. I have no excuses. That day, I stayed silent when I saw Kevin and Patrick doing wrong. I was afraid, but I know that doesn't justify my inaction." He took a deep breath, his voice breaking slightly. "I came to apologize. I know my words won't erase the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. I've resigned from the force, and I'm going to dedicate myself to community service." Joseph studied him for a long moment. His aged eyes seemed to see straight into Marcus's soul. Finally, he spoke softly. "You're still young, Marcus. You made a mistake, but I believe that true remorse can mend a lot of things. Don't just say you're sorry. Live in a way that makes up for what you've done." Marcus extended the small bag toward Joseph. "I brought some flower seeds. I thought maybe they could help make your garden even more beautiful." Joseph accepted the gift, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Thank you, Marcus. You can start over. Plant the right seeds in your heart." Marcus walked away, a weight lifting from his shoulders as though a long-held burden had finally been released. Within him, a small seed of change had begun to take root and grow. 3 months after the trial, Joseph's garden had returned to life, bursting with vitality. Rows of lush green vegetables, heavy tomatoes, and vibrant golden pumpkins sprawled across the space. A small, newly paved path led to the wooden bench where Joseph often sat each morning, admiring the fruits of his labor. David, Sarah, and many townspeople came to help Joseph tend the garden every weekend. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air as they picked vegetables and flowers. The sound of joy and cheerful conversation erased the shadows that had once loomed over the town. On a bright, sunny day, Joseph hosted a gathering in his garden. Tables were set up, covered with bread, fresh fruit, and simple but heartwarming dishes. Standing in the center of his garden, Joseph's voice rang out, gentle yet full of meaning. "Thank you all for being here today. Life is like this garden. Sometimes it gets damaged, but if we are patient and care for it together, it will bloom again. Hope and justice are the same. We cannot let darkness destroy what is good." The crowd erupted into warm, heartfelt applause. Sarah stepped forward, capturing a photo of Joseph standing in the middle of his garden, a place that had once been destroyed but was now thriving, full of life and beauty. David stood beside his father, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You were right, Dad. As long as we don't give up, justice and all that is good will always prevail." Joseph smiled, his gaze sweeping over his beautiful garden and the people filled with love who had gathered there. He knew that no matter how many storms may come, as long as hope remains, everything can be restored and become even better than before. As the sun began to set, it bathed the garden in golden light. The final rays sparkled on the green leaves, a testament to the triumph of light and hope over darkness. Half a year after the historic trial, the small town that was once shrouded in darkness had completely transformed. The once quiet, empty streets were now bustling with life. People walked with confidence, their eyes brighter than ever before. The fear that had lingered for so long, like a layer of dust, had finally been swept away. At Joseph's garden, visitors arrived daily. Joseph had become a living symbol of hope and resilience. Townspeople often stopped by to chat, share small stories, and help him care for the flourishing rows of vegetables. David sat on the old wooden bench across from his father. He sipped his cup of hot tea, the soothing scent of mint and jasmine lingering in the crisp air. Childhood memories flooded back to him, times when he would help his father till the soil and plant seeds. Though his tiny hands could accomplish so little back then, Joseph looked at his son, his eyes filled with indescribable pride. "You've done what I never dared to imagine, David. I couldn't stand against that injustice alone. But you've shown me, and everyone else, that justice still exists." David set his cup down, a soft smile on his lips. "You taught me about kindness and patience, Dad. You always believed in what was right, and I simply picked up where you left off." The sound of children laughing echoed from the far end of the garden. A group of kids ran around, picking ripe tomatoes and playing near the bright yellow marigold bushes. Sarah walked over, holding a bundle of purple lavender in her hands, her smile radiant. "Mr. Joseph, David, your garden looks even more beautiful today." Joseph smiled warmly, his gaze full of gratitude as he looked at Sarah. "Thank you, Sarah. You were the one who lit the first torch in that dark night. David and I couldn't have done this without your courage." Sarah blushed, her cheeks flushing pink. "I just did what needed to be done." The three of them sat beneath the branches of the old apple tree. Its branches were heavy with ripe red apples, a testament to the garden's rebirth. Joseph told the children gathered around stories about the garden and the importance of courage. The children, their bright, innocent eyes wide with wonder, listened in silence, absorbing every word as though it were a precious gift. Meanwhile, at town hall, a large meeting was underway, attended by town leaders and the newly appointed police chief, Margaret Cole, the former administrative assistant who had provided critical evidence during the trial, now stood as a member of the Community Oversight Council. Standing at the podium, her voice was clear and resolute. "We've all seen what happens when power goes unchecked. We cannot allow it to happen again. The Community Oversight Council will ensure that every action of the government and the police force is transparent and fair." The room erupted into applause, echoing with support. For the first time in the town's history, the people felt they had a voice and the power to protect each other. A large banner hung in the hall, reading, "Justice belongs to everyone." The new police chief stepped up to the podium, nodding to the crowd. "I promise you all this. What happened before will never happen again. We will build a police force that is strong, honest, and dedicated to serving the people." The town collectively exhaled a sigh of relief. The shadows of the past had finally lifted, replaced by the light of a new dawn. Spring returned, carrying with it the fragrance of blooming flowers and the warmth of gentle breezes. Joseph's garden, now known as the Garden of Justice, had become a cherished landmark in the town. Neatly arranged rows of vegetables, flower trellises, and fruit trees thrived with life. In one corner of the garden, a small handmade sign stood proudly, etched with the words, "Here, we learn to stand up, to fight, and to reclaim justice. Let us always keep faith in what is good." On that day, Joseph hosted a small ceremony. People from all over the town gathered, bringing with them smiles and heartfelt wishes. Sarah and David worked together to prepare tables overflowing with fresh fruits and vegetables harvested from the garden. Standing before the crowd, David's voice rang out strong, yet full of warmth. "This fight was never just my father's or mine. It was a fight for all of us. We've learned that only by standing up can we change our fate. This garden no longer belongs just to Mr. Joseph. It is now a symbol of kindness, hope, and justice for the entire town." Applause erupted, resounding through the garden like a celebration of triumph. Joseph stood quietly, looking over his garden. His aged eyes glistened with tears, but they were tears of pride and happiness. He leaned over to David, his voice soft as it mingled with the wind. "Son, I think I found the most beautiful seed in this garden." David turned to his father, raising an eyebrow curiously. "And what seed is that, Dad?" Joseph smiled, his gaze sweeping across the joyful faces of the townspeople gathered together. "It's kindness, David, the seed of kindness, when planted and nurtured, grows and spreads everywhere. Sarah approached, holding a basket of lavender flowers, and handed them to Joseph. These are for the man who planted the seeds of hope. Joseph took the flowers, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. Laughter and golden spring sunlight filled the garden, creating a scene of pure happiness. Children ran and played freely, while adults sat together, sharing conversations about the future and the good that had come from their unity. David stood still, taking in the sight before him. A deep sense of joy and peace filled his heart. The battle he and his father had fought was over, but a new journey had begun. The journey to sow seeds of faith and kindness in the hearts of others. And that garden would remain forever, a lasting reminder that the light of justice could always overcome the darkness of injustice. On a summer morning, the sky was clear and blue, and golden sunlight poured like honey over the small town streets. David woke up early and decided to take a walk through the garden with his father. The ground was still slightly damp after the previous night's rain, and the fresh green sprouts seemed to whisper softly to the earth and sky. Joseph, leaning on his cane, walked slowly between the rows of vegetables, though his health was still fragile. His eyes sparkled with indescribable joy as he watched the plants stretching upward with strength and life. David walked silently beside him, cherishing every moment. "Do you see, David? The garden has come back to life," Joseph said, his aged hand gently touching a tomato branch heavy with fruit. "This land is like people. Even when it's trampled on or destroyed, it can come back to life if given enough love and care." David smiled, nodding in agreement. "And people are like seeds. We just need to plant them in the right place, and they'll grow into something good." Both father and son stopped by the old wooden bench under the apple tree. From a distance, they noticed a man approaching the garden gate. It was Marcus Reed. Marcus looked different now. Gone was the tension and fear in his demeanor. He wore a simple shirt, carrying a hoe and a few bags of seeds in his hands. Joseph smiled and nodded in greeting as Marcus stepped closer. "What brings you here, Marcus?" Marcus lowered his head slightly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mr. Joseph, I promised to make amends and start over. I'd like to help you tend this garden, if you'll allow me." David looked at Marcus, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into warmth. Joseph studied Marcus for a moment, then nodded gently. "This garden has always been open to those who wish to lend a hand. If you're sincere, you can start today." Marcus smiled faintly, as though a weight had been lifted from his heart. Rolling up his sleeves, he stepped into the garden and began working alongside Joseph and David. The sound of the hoe hitting the earth, the trickling of water from the watering can, and the hum of quiet conversation blended into the peaceful garden atmosphere, creating a symphony of healing. From a distance, Sarah captured the moment with her camera. Through her lens, she saw the three men representing the past, present, and future working together to plant new seeds. It was a picture of redemption, growth, and the promise of new beginnings. As time passed, the town continued to change. Reforms within the local government and police force brought renewed trust to the people. The Community Oversight Council, led by Margaret Cole, established a hotline for residents to report abuses of power or misconduct. After concluding the lawsuit, David received numerous job offers from prosecutors' offices in major cities. However, he declined them. He chose to stay in the town for a while longer to be close to his father and continue supporting the community. One morning, as David and Sarah sat drinking coffee in a small cafe near the garden, Sarah slid a piece of paper across the table toward him. It was a manuscript titled, "The Torch in the Darkness, The Story of Joseph Miller." David looked up at her, surprised. "You wrote this book?" Sarah smiled and nodded. "Yes, I want people to know this story, to understand that even in the darkest times, when just one person stands up, the light will spread. Mr. Joseph, and you are my greatest inspiration." David gazed into Sarah's eyes, his smile softening. "Thank you, Sarah. This story deserves to be told. It's not just about my father. It's about everyone who stood up for justice." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "This book will be a light for those who need hope." David. In the following months, Sarah's manuscript was published and quickly became a nationwide sensation. The story of Joseph Miller and the small-town trial spread across the country, becoming a powerful symbol of faith in justice and the courage to stand up for what is right. A year after the trial, the town welcomed a new spring with joy and excitement. The Garden of Justice had become a place for people to gather. It was no longer just a garden but a symbol of rebirth and unity. On a beautiful morning, Joseph sat on his wooden bench, watching families work together in the garden. Children ran around cheerfully, watering the vegetable beds. Marcus Reed had become an active member of the community. He regularly helped Joseph and organized gardening workshops for the children. From a distance, David watched it all, his heart swelling with pride. Turning to his father, he spoke softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Dad, you planted this seed, not just in the garden but in everyone's hearts." Joseph smiled, his eyes shining with happiness. "That's what I've always believed, son. Kindness will always bloom if we know how to plant it and care for it." Sarah approached, carrying a freshly carved wooden sign. On it, the words read, "Plant kindness, and it will bloom in the hearts of all." Joseph looked at the sign, tears quietly slipping down his cheeks. He reached out, gently running his hand over the carved letters as if touching a dream that had finally come true. David, Sarah, Marcus, and the townspeople gathered together under the golden sunlight. Together, they placed the sign at the entrance of the garden. It would serve as a reminder for future generations, a story that changed not just a garden but an entire town. Joseph looked around, seeing the smiles on everyone's faces. His eyes closed gently, his heart full of peace. His life had finally become a thriving garden, a place where kindness, hope, and justice bloomed in full glory. In the distance, the sun slowly set behind the rows of trees, leaving the sky painted in hues of red and orange. It was the sunset of a long day but also the dawn of a new future. A future that Joseph and David had created together. A new year began, carrying with it the first rays of spring sunlight. The small town buzzed with the joyful sounds of laughter, birdsong, and distant church bells ringing softly. Today was special, Spring Festival, a tradition the townspeople had revived to celebrate the positive changes within their community. Joseph's garden had been chosen as the heart of the festival. Long tables were set up, adorned with bread, fruits, vegetables, and traditional dishes lovingly prepared by the townspeople. Colorful ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and the sound of an acoustic guitar echoed from the corner of the garden, where a local musician played cheerful melodies. Joseph sat in his familiar wooden chair beneath the apple tree, wearing a crisp white shirt and an old, well-loved fedora. A contented smile lit up his face as he watched everyone gather, from the elderly to small children. This was something he had never dared to dream of, a community united in harmony and filled with love. David approached his father, holding a small paper lantern with a glowing candle inside. Sarah followed behind him, her arms full of lanterns, a radiant smile on her face. "Dad, we're going to light up the garden tonight," David said, placing the lantern gently into Joseph's hands. Joseph looked at the flickering flame inside the lantern as if seeing something far greater. His eyes misted over with emotion as he murmured softly, "This flame will never go out." Sarah smiled, holding up one of the lanterns as she called out to the crowd, "Everyone, let's light up this garden together." Each lantern represents a promise, that we will always stand up for what's right and plant the seeds of kindness. One by one, children and adults alike picked up a lantern and lit it. As the sun began to set, the golden glow of the lanterns illuminated the garden, creating a scene of breathtaking beauty and quiet reverence. Hundreds of glowing lanterns hung across the garden, shimmering like stars scattered across the night sky. From a quiet corner, Marcus Reed watched the scene unfold. He held a lantern in his hands, a sense of peace washing over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Kneeling under a tomato trellis, he placed his lantern gently on the ground and whispered, "I will live differently, I promise." The festival stretched into the late hours of the night. Laughter, conversations, and music danced on the spring breeze, weaving a tapestry of joy and renewal. In the center of the garden, Joseph and David sat side by side, watching the lanterns glow softly all around them. "Do you see, David?" Joseph said in his warm, steady voice. "Sometimes, all it takes is lighting one small lantern. From there, the light spreads." David nodded, his heart overflowing with peace. He knew that his father's story, the story of this garden, and the story of the town would live on, a lantern lighting the way for generations to come. 3 years later, the small town had transformed completely. The roads had been repaired, and the market buzzed with life like never before. A small monument had been erected at the center of town to honor Joseph Miller's story and his journey to reclaim justice. Engraved on the monument were the words, "Justice, kindness, and hope. Always hold onto your faith." Joseph's Garden, now officially named the Garden of Justice and Hope, had become a renowned landmark. Schools from the region regularly organized field trips for students to visit the garden, hear Joseph's story, and learn about the values of courage, perseverance, and justice. Rows of vibrant tomatoes, pumpkins, and golden marigolds stretched across the garden, symbolizing rebirth and constant growth. David had returned to his role as a federal prosecutor, but he often came back to visit his father. Each time, they would sit under the apple tree, looking out over the garden and sharing stories. On an autumn afternoon, David brought a letter with him when visiting his father. Sitting beside him, David's voice carried pride and joy. "Dad, Sarah's book has been chosen as part of the curriculum in many schools. Your story will be told forever." Joseph looked at his son, his eyes welling with tears. "Then we have planted a good seed, David." Suddenly, a group of children ran into the garden, carrying small bags of seeds in their hands. A boy, about 10 years old, walked up to Joseph, his bright, wide eyes full of curiosity and excitement. "Sir, I want to learn how to grow plants. I want my garden to be as beautiful as yours." Joseph chuckled softly, his eyes glowing with happiness. He leaned down, patting the boy gently on the shoulder. "Well then, young man, let's start by planting a good seed." David stood back, watching his father surrounded by the children, his heart swelling with emotion. Joseph's life had become more than just his own story. It was now a legacy, a torch that would continue to be passed on. That evening, as the sun began to set, the golden light of the sunset bathed the garden in warmth. New sprouts pushed through the soil, promising a bright future. The children's laughter echoed through the air, blending with the rustling wind and the rich, earthy fragrance of the garden. Joseph looked around, his garden filled with love and hope. He reached for David's hand, his voice gentle. "Always remember, son, every good seed we plant, no matter how small, has the power to change the world." David nodded, a radiant smile on his face. He knew this story would never truly end. It would live on in the hearts of those inspired by it and in the seeds of kindness planted everywhere. The garden, the story, and the light of justice would remain forever.